welcome back to Breaking Brad. This has been an amazing beginning to this show coming out. I mean, we've had thousands of subscribers in just the first few weeks. Wildly exceeded even my, expectations, fantasies, hopes. I just wanted to get information out there that I thought maybe was trapped in my head because I sort of had an inside view as an outsider coming into this industry. I'm just really happy everybody seems to be, enjoying it, subscribing. So thank you for being part of this. So today's episode, I'm doing by myself. There was a period of time where I very much felt by myself. When I was battling the organism that I talked about in the first episode, put me on the couch for 5 years. Antibiotics were on a steady diet along with yogurt and probiotics, but that was like throwing a Dixie cup of water at a forest fire. So every single year, I go to a conference or multiple conferences to meet with other people that have an interest in battling what we call antibiotic or antimicrobial resistance. The fancy acronym is AMR, and one of the biggest problems I think we have is that everybody speaks in acronyms that nobody knows what they mean. And during those conferences, we all get together in a building that isn't live broadcast anywhere, that isn't open tickets to everyone. And everybody looks at each other and says, yeah, we have a problem. Which it feels a bit like being under a table during an earthquake and looking at the person next to you and saying the room's shaking. It's like we all know there's a problem. But it's such an echo chamber of academics and people in tweed jackets and glasses saying, the same PowerPoint every year. We have this incredible health threat facing us, one that, in my opinion, maybe the most dire there is, that the rest of the world doesn't know about, and there's really been no progress in it. So this show is an opportunity for me to talk to the people that should be in those conferences, that are walking by the front door and don't know they're happening, about the battle that I faced that began my whole journey, the battle with the resistant bacteria. And this episode is, really what started it all for me. So what is resistance? What is antibiotic resistance? What is antimicrobial resistance? It's evolution. It's natural. It is what has always happened. It is what is sort of going to keep happening if we keep acting the way that we're acting. Just unfortunately, we are not giving ourselves the tools to battle it. So we've all heard the moms and the doctors say, don't forget to finish your antibiotics. Don't forget to take the full course. Nobody ever says why. You just hear something like you might get a resistance or you might get resistant, but then they don't explain it further. I'm about to. So take a human and think about a human generation. Human generation is about 20 to 30 years. Now, if we are faced with what we could call a non-lethal threat on a consistent basis, over maybe 1,000 generations, years that none of us will know what's happening by then, our bodies, our genes, our species may develop a resistance mechanism to that non-lethal threat. Maybe our fingers will finally turn into an arc because we're getting so much carpal tunnel from, typing on our phones or something. It's a resistance mechanism to inevitable carpal tunnel syndrome from too many phones. So bacteria, on the other hand, don't take thousands of years. They take hours or days to develop those resistance mechanisms. So let's take a single bacteria and use it as an example. We all remember the fast food outbreaks of E. coli. You could stop by Jack in the Box and get a stomachache as a result. So a single E. coli, just one little bacteria, which is about 0.5 micron or so. It's about 1/150th the size of a human hair, I think, in terms of size. So not a big thing to be thinking about, not something you'd see, can replicate itself 69 billion times in 12 hours. That's like every 15 to 20 minutes. So every one of those is a generation, which means there's thousands of generations taking place on a consistent basis in bacteria. Over the course of a single human lifetime, they'll have 500,000 generations of bacteria. And every single one of them is one bad luck mutation away from an extinction event. Let's go back to E. coli for an example. If you are given an antibiotic to battle your jack-in-the-box gut because you ended up sick from it, and you don't take the full course, you're essentially exposing a bacteria to a non-lethal dose of antibiotic because you haven't taken enough to actually kill the organisms. It will then learn because you are giving it an instruction manual by not killing it, but saying, hey, look, this is the thing that may kill me. How do I prevent myself from dying in the future? They can develop resistance mechanisms almost instantly, within days. So that 69 billion bacteria that I talked about, of those 69 billion, usually about 1.5 million or so is the average, will already be resistant to whatever the local threat is, and then just start logarithmically, reproducing on its own with that resistant gene in itself. And that's how you end up with a whole new strain of bacteria that is resistant to that antibiotic that you have not taken enough of a dose of to actually kill it. And when you're constantly taking antibiotics, when you're constantly putting antibiotics in food, when you're constantly putting it in agriculture, we're just exposing bacteria to non-lethal doses of these drugs. And they're just learning constantly, evolving constantly, replicating algorithmically, exponentially, all the adverbs you can think of is how fast they go. And that would be okay if we were simultaneously developing the tools to battle those super strains, those super bugs, that's where that term comes from, to beat them. But we stopped. And we stopped because of economics. The absolute worst reason to stop something, to stop basically protecting humans, to stop protecting ourselves, to stop protecting everybody, is money. The antibiotic industry is plagued by a bad return for investors. And it's an unbelievable crisis. It is probably the biggest health crisis you've never heard of, is that we are running out of antibiotics and we are facing the largest rise in superbugs, in history. Before antibiotics, when a soldier would get shot in the leg or you'd get a bad scrape and not take good care of it, it was an amputation possibility. Pregnancy complications were, potentially fatal for the mothers. And, it was a different world. We couldn't do surgery, just happenstance because we didn't have antibiotics to prevent organisms from entering, an open body and getting sick. It was high risk every time. And this was not that long ago. This was like the 40s when we're talking about. And you have to imagine the invention of a drug that can make it so that there were signs that said things like, because of penicillin, he can come home, with wounded, war heroes, that were put up in windows and newspaper articles that came out. It must have been like being alive when something like cancer would be cured, because it was such a common, concern that everybody had to have. Every scratch becomes an amputation risk, is a place that I don't want to end up again. And we are getting dangerously close to going back to that pre-antibiotic era where even a scratch becomes high risk, where we can't do surgery anymore. We can't do knee replacements, hip replacements, super high risk surgery without antibiotics, because if you get infected hardware, you could lose everything. Heart transplants, all of this like palace of innovation that we've built, gene therapies and incredible technology, they're all built on the foundation of the fact that if this patient gets an infection, we can take care of it. So we literally have, like I said, a palace of innovation, but it's sitting on the San Andreas Fault right now. And it's about to crack, and it's about to fall apart unless we do something. And I would hate for that to happen because nobody really understands the extent of the problem at hand. The gentleman who discovered penicillin His name was Alexander Fleming. We may have heard the story of the unkempt British laboratory technician who had a dirty desk and came back from a break, and there was a piece of bread with some mold on it, and he was noticing that there was sort of a ring around the mold and the bacteria were sort of not infiltrating it. And that led to some curiosity about what was coming out of that mold that was preventing bacteria from actually, living around it. And that mold literally, is the mold that developed penicillin. That's the mold that changed the world. There's even an incredible musical about that mold right now, which is a really clever way to get information out there. That man ultimately earned the Nobel Prize. And in 1945, when Alexander Fleming was giving his Nobel Prize speech, he warned everyone. He said, "There may come a day when penicillin is available in every drugstore. And then we run the risk of overusing it and losing it." That was 1945. And here we are nowadays. I think 80% of our antibiotics on average go into just the food system, which means there's just tiny doses of antibiotics just being thrown out there, to expose everybody and expose these organisms and teach them how to beat us. I mean, why didn't we listen to the guy who literally was the first person who discovered this stuff? It's rather terrifying. Let's pretend for a moment that I am an antibiotic developer as a company, somebody who wants to put new antibiotics out. And I'll tell you a story about when I tried to put out a product for antimicrobial resistance and how poorly that worked out. But let's just pretend for a moment I am the CEO of a new antibiotic company, about 50% of which usually go out of business shortly after getting their product approved, by the way. And I am in a room full of people trying to pitch them for investment to develop a new antibiotic. Let's say you have shares in that company, just like you might have shares in Apple or Google or Tesla or usual stock, because these companies are for-profit companies. And, if anybody has a retirement account out there, it's probably invested in some pharma companies. And I get up on stage at a shareholder meeting and I say, "Hey, everybody, I want to spend the next 10 years investing hundreds of millions or $1 billion in developing a new antibiotic, but nobody's ever going to use it and it's going to lose money. Are you going to write me a check?" The answer to that is probably no. I'd probably get fired as a CEO for saying that. I mean, can you imagine the CEO of Google or the CEO of Apple getting up there and saying, "Hey, I'm going to go spend $1 billion or, a bunch of our resources on something that I know is going to lose money"? No, that person's not going to get an investment. So why is that the case with antibiotics? So because there are so few new antibiotics as a byproduct of this bad economic cycle I just talked about, doctors are afraid to use them when they come out because of that unbelievably fast resistance that gets generated the second a new one becomes available. It is literally responsible medicine for a doctor to take a brand new antibiotic that is a new tool that bacteria have not yet developed resistance to and start using it before he needs to. No, instead, if I develop a new antibiotic, let's just say for MRSA, it's a bug that people have heard of. There was, a lot of to-do about MRSA back in the day in the football world and the military world. Methicillin-resistant Staph aureus is what it stands for. There's a brand new MRSA drug, while drugs like vancomycin and Bactrim still can work against MRSA, and I start using that brand new one before I've exhausted the other ones, I'm now running the risk of ruining the efficacy of the new one. So we have this situation where responsible doctors have to lock that new drug behind glass like a fire extinguisher and break the glass in case of emergency. So again, not a great commercial model where I'm going to develop something that is only used in case of an emergency, and we just can't get funding to develop these new drugs. Instead, we get new wrinkle drugs. I think we've had 10 in the past, or 15 or so probably in the past 10 or 20 years. We get drugs for opioid-induced constipation, which just blows me away. There's at least 4 drugs for that. I think we have 26 drugs for erectile dysfunction. I'm sure there's people out there that are happy about that, but we've had 2 new classes of antibiotics, I believe, in the past 10 years. We've had some sort of baby ones that are not new mechanisms of action, and at least 50% of those companies go out of business, relatively quickly. Doctors have run out of tools in their tool bag to battle these new organisms that they are facing. I actually have firsthand experience trying to raise money for an AMR product. And this is where it's interesting. You know, I'm an AMR survivor who is very active in terms of speaking for reform in the space. And the product that I was, or the idea that I was pitching for investment actually had more commercial viability potential than a traditional antibiotic. I actually had the CEO of a fund dedicated to investing in AMR products on a Zoom with two very high up people at the CDC Superbug division who said, "We need this," and I quote, and I still got turned down. So if I can't get investment, given my experience in the space, my experience developing other products, and with literally the world's foremost experts telling the CEO of a fund dedicated to this area, we need this, I feel like everybody's fucked unless we do something. That still to this day just grinds my gears, to quote that Family Guy episode. But man, imagine going out there and trying to go to a fund that isn't dedicated specifically to this subject, and they're not even going to take the phone call. A drug development company that creates things just for the good of people that won't be used sounds like a charity, unfortunately. It doesn't exist. There are charities out there that are deploying capital for work in the area, amazing organizations, places like Guard P. The Gates Foundation has deployed a bunch of capital in this. The companies that are out there that develop drugs for commercial use cannot convince their shareholders, no matter how much they want to, and I know a lot of these executives, they want to work on this, to lose money. And you can understand that as somebody who may or may not be in the stock market, may or may not have a retirement fund that somebody is managing, that you don't want them to lose your investment money. So I think this is one of the situations where we need the government to step in. The Food and Drug Administration and Congress have actually enacted mechanisms for drugs or diseases that have a small market opportunity for the companies to try and entice them into working on these things, because they recognize that there are no markets for them. They have, as an example, in 1983, they passed something called the Orphan Drug Act, because in the late 70s, a group of people called the National Organization for Rare Disease, NORD, which is a huge organization now, they were sort of a grassroots organization then, and a bunch of people with really rare disorders, things that, do not affect a huge chunk of the population, got together and they said, dude, there's no drugs for what we have because pharma is not going to spend money to develop them because there's no market. So they lobbied, they pounded on doors, and they got Congress to pass an act that would actually incentivize drug companies to make drugs for rare diseases. They called them orphan diseases. So in 1983, they passed the Orphan Drug Act, which gives pharma more years of exclusivity on the market. It gives them faster and cheaper clinical trials. It gives them tax benefits. It gives them expedited review processes sometimes. And it completely changed the development environment. Like, the investment funds got really excited about these rare diseases, and all of a sudden, like, a huge chunk of the funding, I think at one point it was like 80% of the investment was going into things for rare diseases. It was almost a loophole at one point that I feel like got shot with an elephant gun, where all these people were making drugs that could be used for a rare disease, and then ultimately it sort of titrates down to a larger, population. But it worked. We proved that if you incentivize development in something with a small market, that it can change the investment environment and actually get people behind it. I don't understand why, when we've got so few drugs for something that affects so many people, why we don't have the same act for rare drugs, not just rare diseases. I feel like we should be copy pasting that act just right onto antibiotic development. It's already there. It doesn't even need to be rethought. Just all of those same incentive programs for drugs for antimicrobial resistance. There's another program called the Neglected Tropical Disease Program within the FDA, where if there's a disease that is in another country that has yet to enter the US borders. Something like Ebola would be a good example. They also want us to work on that because it could become a threat to the United States. So they created something called the Expedited Review Voucher Program as a way to come up with something that people could monetize just for working on these programs that, I mean, there may be nobody that ends up taking this drug for a while. So it's not exactly a hot market, but you got to spend a ton of money to work on it. So if you develop a therapy for one of these neglected tropical diseases, when you submit for approval, you get one of these priority review vouchers that we call a golden ticket in pharma, ironically, because it gives you half the time on the review process, which can be anywhere from 12 to 15 months to get a product out there. But here's the kicker. It's a transferable priority review voucher, which means we can sell it. So if you're a giant drug company, with something like a Viagra Plus or, a new, wrinkle drug that's going to, take over the market, and you could cut the time to market in half, cut it in, 6 months from 12, 7 months from 14, you're going to buy that because you could submit that with your new drug data and get half off on your review time. So those will go for like $150, $175 million, just those review vouchers, at least to create a reason to work on something. It's an incentive program for companies to spend money on things that they will ultimately not make any money on, but at least it's good for the population. Again, there is a mechanism by which we can induce, incentivize, prioritize, encourage antibiotic development that is there for diseases that we have, in some cases, never even seen yet, that we can use for antibiotic development, which means it makes more sense for me as a company to go and work on something that isn't even in the United States yet, isn't killing anybody in the United States, let alone millions of people like it's projected to kill and already does kill on a yearly basis. It makes more sense for me to go to, some remote part of another world and cure that than it does for me to save people from MRSA here economically. So I don't get it why we haven't moved those programs over to a problem that is here, a problem that is now, and a problem that makes something like COVID with a 1% fatality rate that shut down society looks like a fucking Care Bear, in terms of how dangerous it is. There are organisms out there that can defeat every antibiotic in days, that are just fatal. There's no other way to put it. It's not meant to create germaphobes because bacteria are part of our world. We need to learn to live with them. In fact, micro exposure to things turns out to be a good thing. My dad's a doctor. I swear he was never sick, by the way. And I think it's because he was always in the hospital, like getting little micro exposures to things. So we do need to get dirty. I need to encourage everybody to get dirty because having a little bit of immunity is a good thing, by the way. So don't wash your hands and sanitize every time you touch everything. Let your kids get dirty. It's good for their immunity. These diseases, these bacteria, these airborne organisms, these bugs that are everywhere are not COVID level fatal. They are COVID on steroids with Avengers skills fatal. And we are literally one bad luck mutation away from what could be an extinction event. And we're doing nothing about it because the economics don't work. And I find that to be disturbing as somebody who had to battle a resistant organism and ended up with only one antibiotic that worked on it because I had to take so many. I had to take so many antibiotics that it learned, how to beat it in my body. And they run these things called antibiotic sensitivity tests where they'll take the organism that they culture out of your infection and they'll expose it to different types of antibiotics just so the doctor can know what might still work. I was lucky one even still worked. There are people out there that run out of options, and infectious disease doctors have to come out to lobbies and talk to families and say, there's nothing left. We don't have any more drugs. And the answer is because of the money that it takes to develop it and because of the lack of profit that comes from it. if you're a for-profit company, which the pharma companies are, it sucks, but they are, unless you guys want to socialize everything, which I don't think is the answer. You know, we need companies to develop things. They have shareholders to answer to, they have the market to answer to. If they just start putting all their money into losing propositions, they're all going to go to business anyway. And then unfortunately, when companies actually magically get funding, to develop an antibiotic, maybe through grants, maybe through charity organizations, they end up out of business anyway because nobody's using their product in the commercial environment because we have that fire extinguisher thing going on. This is one of those places where our tax dollars actually need to come and help us a bit. And it might just be because of lack of, disseminating this information in a digestible way that we're talking about. It's all fucking acronyms. It's AMRs and CREs and MRSAs and Pseudomonas and this and that. And I feel like when the people that write papers about this stuff, the title is like illegible to me. I've been studying this stuff for years. It's like they're just writing it so their friends will read it. So it needs to be put out there in a way that everybody can understand. Antibiotic resistance is the biggest health threat you probably don't know about. There are reasons why people tell you to do certain things like finish your antibiotics that they've never explained why. And we need to start using them responsibly, treating them like the tools that they are, and encouraging the deployment of our tax dollars or our anything that goes into the system to be used to develop them. And there's models out there. There's a bill sitting in Congress that has bipartisan support. I've spoken about this bill in like DC before because I wanted to get passed so bad. It's called the Pasteur Act. It's not like anybody's arguing over it. It's not like it's a blue or red bill. Like everybody's into it, but it's just sitting on the floor, and it's a subscription model that actually the UK is of course ahead of us because we always end up behind these other countries that are forecasting, how their populations might be affected by future problems, where pharma companies that develop new antibiotics can essentially get paid like a yearly subscription fee for the government to have access to these antibiotics. And at least there's an economic model then for they can go to these investment funds and say, look, once we develop this, at least we'll get the subscription payment from the government. There's something to pitch at that point. We don't have anything at this juncture. And it's just sitting there. It's like nobody can push it through, possibly because of the lack of information. Maybe the people in the government just don't understand how bad the problem is. It's bad. Please push it through. It's just sitting there and everybody's supporting it from both sides. Retweet, truth, X, whatever the mention, get this out there. Like call and yell at your congressman to get that bill pushed through or whatever we can do to help with that. But we're going to end up calling other countries and saying, hey, I know you guys have been incentivizing antibiotic development. Can we borrow some at some point soon? That's pretty sad for, we're supposed to be the most technologically advanced country out there. We have no excuse anymore for not learning about this problem. We have informational tools at our disposal, like artificial intelligence, that can teach us things in any way, shape, or form. I often say, talk to me like I'm a third grader. I literally say that to my ChatGPT app all the time, teach it to me like I'm a kid. And I don't have a background in this stuff. I'm talking to you about acronyms and organisms and resistance mechanisms and drugs that I didn't learn about in school. I've got a bachelor's in sociology and a master's in education. I love to teach, but I didn't get taught biology in school. I learned it because I had to. I was battling a resistant organism and I needed to find a way to help myself because they were running out of tools, but also because it was like terrifyingly fascinating in the same way. Like, how is all this out there and nobody is talking about it? My mom was a nurse for 30 years and I almost died from an antibiotic resistant infection. And even she asked me only a couple years ago, what does AMR stand for again? I don't expect people to know what that acronym stands for. Why are we still using that acronym? Maybe drug resistance, maybe scary ass superbugs, maybe something. And maybe when we start speaking in English, I'm saying this to all of my colleagues, not just the general public, because these are new terms. People will understand the extent of the threat that's in front of us. There was a 2024 study put out that said there will be I think 39 or 40 million deaths between 2025 and 2050 directly attributable to antimicrobial resistance. That's a big number. And we are not equipped with the tools to battle that threat. Think about how long it takes to create, test, and put through the approval steps for every new drug. That's now that we're in the midst of that. We need to start forecasting future problems. We need to start treating things for the burden that will face our kids, not just, us in 10 or 15 years, and stop with our own personal invincibility complexes and think about what this is going to do for children, their children, and act, if not for us, for them. Because there is no one person that can solve this problem. This is a huge problem that needs I'm going to use the word systemic, as a metaphor here, that needs a systemic response. We need to have laws put in place. We need to have acts passed, bills passed that deploy our dollars on good uses, like, getting funding to the people who know how to make new drugs. And I often think if there were a bad actor out there that, released a resistant bacteria, in a town or something, we probably have an Operation Warp Speed for that bacteria. I don't want this to be reactive again. I want this to be proactive. I don't like that we live in such a reactive society. I want to know that my kids and your kids and their kids are going to be safe and don't have to worry that if they're out on their skateboard and they fall and scrape their knee, that they might lose their leg. That's not a great world to grow up in, and we're getting too close to it. It makes me sad. It makes me motivated. It makes me interested in giving you this information. I'm not intending to scare anybody. I'm asking you to take action, to start learning about this stuff. Even just going on Google and, typing in what is antibiotic resistance, what is antimicrobial resistance, it's a start. Stop taking a half a bottle of pills when your doctor gives you a course of antibiotics. Start actually asking the doctor if you really need the antibiotics in the first place. If you have a cold, if you have the flu, you don't need antibiotics. Antibiotics are for bacteria. Doctors face a ton of pressure nowadays to pass them out to people before they even know what the organism is. If you go to the doctor and you don't get a culture, which means like if you don't stick a swab up your nose or in your throat and call you in a couple days and say what the organism is, giving you an antibiotic is actually irresponsible. Unless they know with certainty it's an infection or you're a high-risk person, they shouldn't be passing them out like packs of gum. And a lot of the problem there is that because they're being pressured by patients, just give me the antibiotic just in case. We can't keep using these things as just in cases. We need to start using them as treatments for diseases or preventions for diseases in high-risk people so that we don't lose them for the rest of time. I had a really cool chance to speak at a meeting called PACCARB, which stands for Presidential Advisory Council Combating Antimicrobial Resistance. I'm probably saying that acronym wrong, but it's called PACCARB, P-A-C-C-A-R-B. It's in DC. They invited me to be a speaker to open the meeting. These are public meetings. It's a task force. I'm appointed to discuss solutions for this problem that we've been talking about, antibiotic resistance. And this is a couple years ago, and it was right after that HBO show was out, The Last of Us, which is about a fungus that turns people into zombies. And I'm sorry to report that a fungus won't turn you into a zombie. It can kill you, but it won't turn you into a zombie. They actually had a whole section in that meeting about the fact that people were getting more interested in this subject because of that show. I also feel like during COVID, just general people were Googling infectious disease stuff. I mean, it was almost like the ability to, what do they call that? Customer acquisition cost. It's like the people are already looking up bugs now, like bugs are in, bug information is in. There's a lot of people talking about vaccines and, people are into health now. The whole Make America Healthy Again movement is like a thing. So now is a good time to be acting on this. And we should take advantage of the fact that conversations are happening. And again, these are bipartisan conversations. These are not, I'm pushing one side over the other. This is, we all need this. It doesn't matter whether you're blue or red, liberal or conservative, bacteria don't discriminate against anybody. You know, if you're at risk in a hospital and you're down the hall from somebody with an airborne organism, doesn't matter how you vote. It couldn't care less. In another episode, I talked about Neosporin not being formally FDA approved. Actually, that topic got a lot of interest, which is super cool that, people wanted to talk about that. It's because it's grandfathered into this thing called the drug monograph system, where they decided those ingredients were, generally regarded as safe, which means anybody can make them, like I talked about before, but nobody has ever submitted Neosporin to the FDA for a formal drug approval. But those monographs, which are essentially pre-written chapters in a very long book about, first aid products and antifungal products and, fever blister products and, topical pain creams, hand sanitizers. These are all like pre-written chapters. Like, these are the products you can use for this, 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 and this. One of them is first aid antibiotics, which I swear may be the most frustrating thing of all for me. And that was sort of what began my like furious fascination with this subject, is if you've got a product that, if you use it too much, is going to not work anymore, which is what an antibiotic is, and you're using it before you even have an infection, which means you've just like scraped your knee on the concrete, you just fell off your skateboard, you just, I don't know, scratched your arm on a window and make up your injury, and you go and you take a perfectly clean cut that has not become infected yet with bacteria. It's not green, it's not pussing, it's not red, it's not showing streaks, and you put an antibiotic on it, you don't need it yet. So just the fact that that rule book allows the words first aid to be on the same friggin' product as antibiotic is teaching people wrong. I don't even feel like that's the general public's fault, because they've seen the words first aid antibiotic for 50 plus years, maybe longer. And that's bad training. That's bad education. That's irresponsible. There are other countries, developed countries, that still treat topical antibiotics as prescription products because they should. That is responsible use. So I don't even fault people for thinking that it's okay to treat an antibiotic like first aid because it's on every pretty yellow tube at every checkout counter in the country. And that's really bad education. So I'm here saying, don't do that. Don't put an antibiotic on something that doesn't need it. Treat it with respect. Because if your throat starts hurting after you watch this, if your ear starts aching after you watch this, and I hope it doesn't, you're not going to go call your doctor and say, hey, I need 1 penicillin as first aid, because that's not how it works. I've spoken countless times about this subject, and I actually stopped attending these conferences because I felt like I was just inside of an echo chamber, and everybody was getting up on stage, including me, talking about how bad this problem is, and we're all just nodding our heads in agreement. I've got a friend named Dr. Sufi who works for Sandoz, a huge pharma company. They're global head of antimicrobial resistance. And I remember one time we were talking about the fact that we would just like to stand at the door and teach people walking by about this subject. And that's what this attempt is by me. It's not standing inside the echo chamber, shouting toward a bunch of people who already agree with me. It's educating people walking past the front door who don't know what the acronyms mean because it's not general knowledge. And maybe this can serve as a digestible call to action, that this is the biggest health crisis that we're facing right now, in my opinion, and nobody knows about it. So we need to treat this with the seriousness that it deserves, because we're kind of at a tipping point. We can't spend every dollar we have from the investment world, from the grant world, from the development world, on developing new therapies for things that still require antibiotics as a backbone. Because what the point if they can't use them anymore? 50% of people with cancer die of antibiotic resistant infections. They don't die from the cancer. That's not what kills them. 50% of them die from an infection that we can't treat because we've run out of tools to beat the organism. That is a sobering statistic. So please, for my kids, your kids, their kids, all of humanity, get behind a serious movement for change in this subject, even if it's just starting to create some public momentum, starting to create some conversation. When people rise up and talk about a problem, when there's enough chatter in the public about the need for change, that's when we typically see action. I hope this can be not an attempt to create fear. It's never been my intention. I survived, an organism that had a 70% fatality rate when it hits your bloodstream. So I should be a testament to the fact that you can beat something no matter how, deadly or dangerous it is. But I got lucky. Not everybody does get lucky. So please share this information. Start having conversations about it. Maybe when you sit down for dinner, don't have a freaky conversation with your kids, but talk to them about, how bugs work a little bit. Some of the information you learned from this episode. Next time you go to the doctor and he says, I'll give you a Z-Pack, and you don't even know if you have a cold or an infection, make sure you need it. Next time you're thinking about pressuring your doctor for one of those Z-Packs or a bottle of penicillin, ask him if he thinks you need it. On that note, I want to thank everybody for actually taking the time to listen to this. Everything began for me with AMR. I actually hope that someday I can build a big enough company that I don't have to worry about spending some extra dollars on something that won't make any money. Like, that is a huge dream of mine because I want to be part of the solution here. But right now I can't. And we need everybody's help. So thank you.